while they were sober. They would make sure to get drunk before they would confirm the decision. On the contrary, if they made the decision when they were sober, when they were drunk, they would have to sober up before they would confirm the decision. They want to work, in other words, with all sides of their brain. They use the alcohol in a very inventive and creative fashion. Alcoholism doesn't come along in the Western world until the 18th century, precisely during the rise of capitalism. So addiction very much is a capitalist disease, having to do with dislocation, having to do with chasing people out their lands, forcing them into these soulless, murderous factories, breaking up communities, creating disconnection, creating suffering of all kinds. And that's the key to addiction. It has to do with suffering. The crystal meth issue that Carl talked about in the downtown east side is very, very interesting. People will sometimes say to me, you know, Doc, I don't understand it, but when most people use crystal meth, they get hacked on it, but when I take it, it really calms me down and I can clean my room. And what these people are telling me, that they're having ADHD. Because well, how do you treat ADHD? With stimulants, which, like crystal meth, elevate dopamine levels. So does nicotine, by the way. And so does cocaine. So very often people are self-medicating. And if they're not self-medicating ADHD, which by the way is a common risk factor for addiction, and it's something I know intimately since I have it myself, they use other drugs. They use heroin for self-medicating PTSD. It's a good medication for PTSD. Dangerous, but symptomatic relief, instantaneous. They use drugs to quell anxiety, to quell depression. And so that what we have to ask, like Felipe does in his quote that I gave you, is what is the functionality of addiction in a person's life? Now, if you look more deeply at the potentially addictive substances and how they're used, you see that in fact they engage brain systems without which life is not impossible. The opiates, for example, why does an opiate work in the human brain? Only because we have our own opiate system, so we have receptors for opiates that are already present long before the person ever meets the opiate. We have an opiate system, which is of course called the endorphin system, and endorphin simply means endogenous morphine-like substance. We have an internal opiate system because it modulates several functions of human life without which life is inconceivable. It modulates pain relief, and of course there's no life without pain relief. Number one. And by the way, the opiates not only soothe physical pain but also emotional pain. And hence, the first issue with addiction is not why the addiction but why the pain. And that answer is very clear if you look at the histories of people or peoples who become addicted. You want to know why the pain? Look at the history of First Nations peoples here in North America. Look at the historical dispossession, oppression, genocidal eradication, forcible removal of their natural ways of life, forced constrictive, oppressed living in restricted areas, and then on top of that, all the abuse that historically has been visited upon them, and in Canada specifically, in residential schools, where Native kids were sexually abused for generation after generation. Then we ask why the addiction? No, ask why the pain. Number one, so it's pain relief. Secondly, the opiates provide us with a sense of pleasure and reward. Pleasure and reward means that we have a sense of elation, a sense of joy, a sense of satisfaction. It's the endorphins that mediate that in the brain. And when the endorphin circuits are underdeveloped, we don't have that. We're ill at ease in our own skins. We're dissatisfied. We're distressed. When we do opiates, then, boy, what a relief. And finally, the opiates modulate what's actually the crucial dynamic in human life, which is put in one word, love. Because without love, there's no human life. Because the human infant is the most helpless, the most immature, and the most dependent. If that infant is not loved, it doesn't live. And without the endorphin apparatus, there's not that attachment between the parent and the child. In other words, life is simply impossible. Carl talked eloquently about the dopamine function in the brain, and of course the basic role of dopamine is to give us a sense of incentive and motivation. So that the little mice in the laboratory, given a pellet of food, will eat it and enjoy it and grow from it, but that same little mouse put the food a few inches away from his nose will actually not budge to eat it will even starve to death rather than eat because genetically they knocked out his dopamine receptors. And that means he's got no incentive and motivation. So without that, there's no human life, or any kind of mammalian life, without that dopamine circuitry. So what I'm saying here is that the addictive tendencies seize hold of brain circuits without which life is completely impossible. And the real question is, why are some people susceptible? The reason they're susceptible is because those circuits never developed in the first place. And Carl pointed very astutely to the question, the diminished activity of dopamine receptors, does that precede or follow the drug use? Well, the reality is that it precedes it. Because in monkeys, they've shown that it's those monkeys who relatively lack dopamine receptor activity who are much more prone to become addicted to cocaine, which is another stimulant. And the question is, why are these circuits underdeveloped? Well, because the reality is that the human brain develops under interaction with the environment. And if the environment is not appropriate, the circuits just don't develop. As to how and why that works, I can't go into, but it has to do with the fact that we have to be born with relatively premature brains because our head is already too big at birth. If we waited any longer in the uterus, nobody would get born. Even the relative narrowness of the human pelvis. And that means that most of our brain development has to occur on the outside, and that means that those circuits are extraordinarily sensitive to what happens. To already stresses on the parent, on the mother during pregnancy, will negatively impact the brain development of the child. And you can stress animals in a laboratory for 20 minutes or 10 minutes once a week in the second trimester of pregnancy, their offspring will be more likely to use cocaine and alcohol as adults. And I could go on and on with that prenatal evidence. And then, of course, in the first years of life, when the human brain grows exponentially, there are times in the first year of life when every second, in that space of time, a million connections are being made. That's a very sensitive period. And by the end of the third year of life, the human brain is 80% adult size. Now, when the parents are stressed, or the child is stressed in that environment, those physiological circuits just don't develop. I'm talking about the physiological development of dopamine receptors. I'm talking, by the way, you can reduce somebody's dopamine receptors simply by isolating them. You can take monkeys and isolate them. They'll diminish the number of receptors. When you put them back into society, the number of dopamine receptors will increase again. So, in other words, human beings are in a lifelong interaction with the environment. That's why it's the context, the setting, that you have to understand. Not just the brain in isolation, and not just the drug in isolation. Which leads us to the kind of society that we live in. Well, the reality is that in our society, for economic, social, and long-term historical reasons, some children have much more difficult than others. And furthermore, there's widespread child abuse in this society. And child abuse is not a moral issue. It's a political, social issue, because when parents are stressed and insecure, they themselves are not treated well, and the loss of community means that there's not enough support and not enough connection, parents tend to be more abusive, and especially if they have a history of abuse themselves. So in the First Nations communities in Canada, where I'm talking about a culture that used to parent much more humanely and much more intelligently than we do, according to all the studies, now kids are abused generation after generation. Why? Because that's all the parents ever knew. And then we talk about the drunken Indians. As if somehow that was endemic in their culture or innate in their genetics. Nah, it's a social historical effect. And it was Dr. Filippi's California studies that showed that for each adverse childhood experience, such as sexual, physical, or emotional abuse, the death of a parent, the loss of a parent, the jailing of a parent, which we're doing massively in this country, as many people have pointed out. For each of those adverse childhood experiences, the risk of addiction in that child go up exponentially. So that by the time a male child has had 6 of these adverse childhood experiences, his risk of having become a substance-using, injection-dependent addict is 4,600% greater than that of a male child with no such experiences. Again, it's the context we have to understand and the history. It also means, of course, that when it comes to treatment, what does that mean? Well, let me read you a quote from my book, In the Realm of Fungi Growths. What have I got? 1 minute? 2? Okay, all right, I'm getting there. Well, you know what? I won't read you the whole book then. It's about a policeman who rescued these kids from internet pornography. And he's a very humane cop, and he extends himself to protect these kids. And he says about these children, that what's worst about it, he said, is that they're not screaming, just accepting. They have dead eyes. You can tell that their spirit is broken. That's their life. Now the irony, of course, is that going through all the studies, if that cop had transferred to the drug squad, who do you think he'd be chasing in the street? Those same kids that he didn't rescue. In other words, in this society, we punish people for having been abused in the first place and then turning to drugs. Not to mention, of course, that we live in a society that devalues human beings in favor of commodifying everything and everybody, in which people are made to feel insecure, in which people are made to feel that they're inadequate, and in which they're made to feel that they have to complete themselves from the outside. In other words, we live in a society that itself, in its very nature, highly addictive. The very idea of the pursuit of happiness. How can you pursue happiness? As there was something on the outside of you. That induces an emptiness, it induces a craving for something to be completing you from the outside. In this society, what do we expect? Well, that many people will turn to addictions to soothe their pain, to soothe their emptiness, to somehow fill the spiritual void in their lives. And this is not a culture that meets people's needs, supports their spirituality or their humanity. That's the context in which we have to understand drug use. Thanks very much.